private jet refused to take off. The engineers tried everything, checked every part, loosened every screw, but all their efforts were in vain. The air on the runway grew heavy, and a light rain fell like the last drop of patience. CEO assistant Richard Callahan ran across the field, his face tense. The pilot tapped the control panel in vain, and the radio crackled with noise as if signaling an inevitable bad omen. Callahan stood by the plane window, holding the phone. His voice was cold and sharp at first, then trembling and choking as he called his business partner, knowing that in just 2 hours, the stock price could plummet, taking all the hard work and assets with it. And then, from the darkness of warehouse number 9, a young boy in greasy work clothes stepped out. In his hands was an old, rusty toolbox, with a quiet, steady calm that belied his age. No name tag, no title, no high position, just a steady step, an unasking gaze, unwavering. All eyes followed his every move. Someone whispered, cautiously asking, "Where is the official mechanic? Why did you let a child out here?" But the boy said nothing, just walked straight toward the silent plane as if he had faced this challenge 1,000 times before, ready to do the unthinkable. Who could fix it? Would it be in time? All eyes followed his every move. In that moment, the entire airport held its breath, waiting for a miracle. The steady rain did little to ease the tension on the runway. As engineers fumbled with equipment, the CEO's assistant kept talking on the phone in a frantic voice, and several people began glancing nervously at their watches. From the end of the runway, a small, thin figure, drenched in rain, was quietly walking towards the unfinished plane. His gray-blue protective suit was stained with old oil, heavy with water, clinging to his body. His hand tightly gripped a rusty metal toolbox, the paint peeling clearly visible like the wrinkles of someone who had lived through more years than he had lived. The box was heavy, but he did not retreat. His eyes, not glistening with rain but with something more solid, were fixed on the faded plane, its belly hanging in the air, like a creature being torn apart in the middle of a hasty, major surgery. Zane Miller, 17, was a man none of them had ever heard of. He wasn't on the list of licensed engineers, nor was he listed in any of the airport's personnel systems. But he walked, as if every stone on the pavement remembered his footprints. He was the only child of Rachel, the head welder at a private machine shop just a zinc wall away. On long, quiet summer days when his peers were roaming the malls or the soccer fields, Zane would sit silently for hours on an old paint can, watching the old engineers' hands as they disassembled fuel systems or inspected jet exhausts as if reciting a forgotten ancient language. No one paid any attention to him. Until today. The CEO's assistant, Linda, was the first to notice the strange movement from afar. At first it was just a surprised blink, but it quickly turned into a wary look. She took a step forward, blocking the way, still holding the phone connected to the air traffic control office, her voice cracking with tension. "What are you doing here?" Zane didn't reply, just nodded, then quietly bent down to set the box down on the concrete. The lid swung open with a rusty creak, revealing a surprisingly neat arrangement of tools. In the left corner, stuck crookedly, was an old sticker of aviator wings. The silver had faded to the point of being almost transparent, but the slanted design made someone who was observant pause longer than usual. As if it were not just a childish decoration, but a symbol of something yet to be named. An engineer beside her raised an eyebrow, but before she could say anything, the co-pilot's harsh voice rang out behind Linda, interruptive and uncompromising. "We don't need a high school student, we need a real engineer." Zane still didn't answer. He crouched down, began examining the landing gear with his bare hands, and then traced a small crack in the engine casing that no one else had noticed. Linda turned her head to look at the co-pilot, but said nothing. That moment, that silence, in the rain, in the chaos, in power and judgment, spoke louder than any words. The wet boy with the rusty box didn't need anyone's permission. He just needed the plane to work, and perhaps that was the only thing the whole world was waiting for right now. As Zane began to remove the engine cover, footsteps approached. Trent Dawson, the pilot, appeared in his neat flight suit, his cold eyes cutting through the overcast sky like a ray of light. "We need a certified mechanic, not a high school dropout," he said, his voice heavy and serious, as if each word carried the weight of an irrevocable judgment. The words washed over the air like a cold wave. Zane didn't flinch or get angry. He just stood there, holding the old screwdriver, looking down calmly, as if he had heard those words 1,000 times before. Trent stepped closer, his eyes scrutinizing Zane's every move, as if he had no right to lay a hand on anything important. Linda, the CEO's assistant, stood a few steps away, her eyes shining with a hint of pity, but her lips still closed, not saying a word. She whispered, her voice soft as if she was just comforting herself in her helpless moment. "He's just a kid." But those words could not ease the tension rising on the wet ground. Pilot Trent stepped back, his voice still cold and unforgiving. "This isn't a playground. We're not here to play with the fate of a $40 million plane." He glanced around, noticing the eyes of the other helpers on Zane, a mixture of suspicion and contempt. Zane said nothing more. He just continued his work, gently unscrewing screws, moving parts with his hands without stopping, as if his body had long been synchronized with the plane. Each turn of the screwdriver, each careful movement, showed a surprising mastery, making the atmosphere around him gradually become strange. Trent took a closer look and said in a harsh voice, "I'm watching you, kid. One slip, and this whole deal could fall apart." But despite the clear threat, Zane didn't flinch. He knew he had no right to protest and could only let his actions speak for themselves. The tension between the people around was heavy. The sound of rain began to fade. The sky seemed to silently witness a wordless but profound confrontation of expectations and prejudices. And in that silence, Zane's hands were still working diligently, not allowing anyone to doubt his ability anymore. Zane leaned down, his hands touching the cold metal of the engine as if he were awakening a sleeping creature amid the soft rain. His fingers were pale with cold, trembling slightly, but he did not hesitate. No one gave him an order. No one instructed him. He just did it, quietly and resolutely, as if what lay before him were not some intricate piece of machinery, but a familiar memory ingrained in his blood. The hatch popped open, and Zane reached deep inside, pulling a tangle of wires from the seeping insulation. The faded colors, blue, yellow, red, like old blood in need of rebirth. He checked every bolt, every signal connection, ducking his head down to the edge of the engine to check the fuel sensor slot on the dashboard that was blinking abnormally. A screwdriver slid through his palm, sliding into place where the number 8 spark plug had been pulled, a neat move that had worked 100 times before. The wind blew through the open cabin, ruffling Zane's dark hair and sticking his jacket to his back. But he didn't look up. The operations continued with almost emotionless precision, as if every pressure valve, every screw, every circuit had been programmed into his memory. Then a little incident happened. As he reached for the thermometer, the old pilot's watch, worn loosely on his wrist, slipped off the edge of his wrist bone. It fell onto the open hatch, hit the metal edge, and clattered to the concrete floor. The glass cracked, the hands were off axis, and a piece flew out as if it had fallen from something that had been preserved for a long time. He stopped, just for a second. No one could see Zane's expression. He just looked down at the empty space where the watch had been, then bowed his head. But instead of picking it up or stepping back, he turned back to his toolbox, pulled out a resistance meter, and inserted it into the wire he was testing. Not a word was spoken. Not a sigh or a complaint. Everything went on as if nothing important had just broken, and as if so many things had broken before. The air around the area had become strange. The people watching from a distance, Linda, Trent, the technician who had initially refused, had stopped shaking their heads in disbelief. There was something about Zane's movements, the chilling precision with which he adjusted a circuit or turned a valve, as if he weren't repairing a plane, but reassembling something the world had once shattered. No one really knows who he is. But his actions, the way he doesn't look at a blueprint, doesn't ask anyone, begin to make it clear to the audience. He's not a normal teenager. And maybe the broken watch is just a small crack in a larger story, a silent memory that Zane wears on his wrist, even if there's no physical evidence to hold it. The black SUV had just turned into the maintenance area when the rear door opened. Under a light rain, Richard Callahan stepped out with an agility that was unusual for a CEO in his 60s. He lowered his umbrella to his shoulder, glanced across the area where the three men were standing near the Falcon business class, then paused as his gaze swept across the cold gray cement floor, where a small object lay quietly, unnoticed. A watch, worn leather strap, water-soaked dial, cracked glass like cracks painted on antique porcelain. And at that moment, time seemed to stop. He stood still. He still had the flight plan in his hand, still held the parachute, but he didn't move a step. His eyes were glued to the watch as if it had called from a previous life. The sounds around him faded, the auxiliary engine, the rain, even someone calling in his ear, all of them faded into the background, leaving a memory to emerge, painfully clear. Texas. 16 years ago. The funeral took place in a sun-bleached field of grass, with no trees, only flags, an oak coffin, and a trumpet blast that cut through the sky. He stood there, clutching his vintage watch, the only one his best friend, pilot Jackson Reed, had ever worn on takeoff. Not because it was expensive. It was the first gift Jackson had received as a pilot, from his father, who had died during a training flight. After the service, Richard bent down and placed the watch on the coffin lid, next to the silver ingot with his name and the pilot's wings. "Fly safe, Jack," he whispered. Then the red dirt covered it. For Richard, it was a complete farewell. Nothing was left. Yet today, in the middle of a cold, damp maintenance bay, right at my feet, that watch appeared again. Cracked, marked with time, but unmistakable. He bent down. His fingers touched the cold glass, where a crack ran across the number 12 like an open wound. He turned it over gently, touching the words, faded with age, but he didn't need to read them. He knew the engraving by heart. To Jack. For skies higher than fear. Behind him, Linda's voice softly said, "Sir?" But he did not reply. Richard raised his head. His gaze followed the direction from which the watch had fallen, and just a few feet ahead, where the Falcon's engine was open, a wet-haired boy was bending over, rewiring the sensor wires with the quiet concentration of a mechanic more accustomed to living among machines than men. No one spoke, but everyone present began to notice the unusual coincidence brewing, not in the boy's skill, but in the thing that had just fallen from his hand. Richard Callahan stood up, his watch in hand. His eyes never left the boy. No one knew what had just unfolded. But something about that unmoving gaze had silenced the entire maintenance bay. A strange kind of silence, as if history had turned right beneath everyone's feet, and no one dared to be the one to interrupt the moment with a thoughtless word. Linda walked briskly into the operations office, rain still drizzle on the shoulders of her coat, but she paid no attention. Every step she took was a race against a growing feeling inside her. An intuition, formless, but strong enough to make her drop every unfinished call just to open the airport's personnel records. The keyboard clicked loudly in the empty space, a green LED flashing across her face as the boy's name was entered into the system. Zane Reed, born in El Paso. Mother, Rachel Ann Reed. No father listed. But then, when she opened the deep archive, the data streams not normally accessible, a name appeared under the temporary guardian list from when he was 4 years old. Jackson Reed, an airline pilot who had died on March 17, 16 years ago, in the Austin-Denver civilian crash. Linda said nothing. Her hands fell limply over the keyboard. The image of the broken watch, like glasses in the rain, came back to her, and she turned to look out the window, where the boy was still adjusting the engine cover, his movements meticulous and not at all haphazard. The pieces began to fit together. But then, as she turned away, another stream of memories opened up, not from her perspective, but from fragments, woven together into a story only those involved could understand. Zane never heard of his father. His hazy childhood memories contained only the image of his mother, standing in a small airplane garage on the outskirts of El Paso, with her sleeves rolled up, surrounded by wind, sand, and the smell of oil. His mother, Rachel, never spoke of triumph, much less tragedy. She told him of a woman who flew the sky like it was home. Zane grew up surrounded by rusted fuselages, nameless toolkits, and someone's dusty technical manuals that no longer existed. He taught himself to read electrical schematics, turning the pages of handwritten books in faded, slanted handwriting, with notes in the margins that seemed to have been written to him after each flight. No one forced him. No one lectured him. Just an almost instinctive patience, as if his hands had learned the feel of bolts, fuel valves, and temperature sensors from a previous life. The only thing his mother had ever given him, and told him to keep it, because it once belonged to someone who flew in the sky, was a pilot's watch with a faded leather strap, a dark dial, and slightly scratched glass. He didn't know why it was special. He only knew that every time he touched it, he felt closer to the father who had never been there. Now, with the maintenance bay lights still illuminating the raindrops, Zane closed his toolbox and touched his bare wrist where his watch had fallen off just minutes before. He didn't know what he'd dropped, but the way Mr. Callahan looked at it, and the way the rest of the cabin stared at him in silence, told him. Something had moved, silently and irreversibly. In the executive office, Linda printed out the file, her hands shaking slightly. She put the printout on the table, said nothing, then walked slowly toward the hangar door, where the unanswered question was silently drilling into the hearts of every witness. If Jackson Reed had flown into the sky to save hundreds of people, then today perhaps it was his son, with his silent hands, who had just saved the Falcon waiting to take off. The engine started up, rhythmically, strangely regular. No one in the maintenance bay said anything. Linda stood by the control panel, her eyes never leaving the young man crouched in the belly of the plane. He didn't look up. Still kneeling, her hand on the instrument cover, as if she could still hear the sound of it, not to check, but as a silent farewell. Richard Callahan approached, his steps slow but steady. The rain had long since stopped, leaving only the damp ground, reflecting the silhouettes of the silver-haired man and a boy whose face had never known glory. He stopped a few steps away from the boy. Then he sat down gently. A gesture that, for a man of his power, suddenly carried a weight different from anything one had seen on a podium or in a conference room. "Reed," he called, his voice low, but loud enough to cut through the silence like a knife cutting through paper. Zane looked up, and in that moment, though no one spoke, everyone understood what was happening. "You saved this Falcon, just like your father saved me, 16 years ago." No one moved. Trent stood behind the engineering door, his hands still slick with machine oil, staring unblinkingly. Linda clutched the printout of the file in her hand, the creases already fading. Callahan touched the broken watch, now carefully placed on a clean white cloth by Linda. He picked it up, looking at it silently, as if he were looking back to a time when trumpets still echoed across the Texas fields, where he had knelt at the grave of the only pilot who had not returned. "I'm not doing you a favor, Reed. I'm just repaying a debt." It wasn't a statement. It was an admission, one he hadn't made to anyone in 16 years. "Your father attended Silvergate Flight Academy," he continued, his eyes still fixed on Zane. "From now on, the Jackson Reed Scholarship, yours. Fees, materials, training, all arranged. We will not send an invitation because this is not an invitation. This is a return." Zane said nothing. His face showed no surprise. Just silence, as if what had just been given was not an opportunity, but a piece of an unfinished business being picked up. Callahan placed the watch on his wrist, slowly, as if he were returning not just a keepsake, but a missing piece in a bloodline that had spanned a generation. Linda turned away. Trent nodded slowly. No one broke the silence, because they all understood. There are moments that need no applause, no praise, because sometimes justice comes not from power, but from memory. And today's memory, just awakened, by a boy named Reed, kneeling silently under the belly of a plane and correcting the past not with words, but with actions. It was late afternoon when Zane stepped out of the technical area. The damp air after the rain made the pavement reflect the shadows of people, as if everything that had just passed was just a nameless dream. In his hands he held an old toolbox, the paint peeled, the hinges rusted, and the handle as loose as it had been when it had been carried across the cold ground. The only thing different was the glass of the watch on his wrist, replaced. Clear as if it had never been broken, but the hand still had a small chip, a reminder that some things can be healed but not forgotten. Linda stood a few steps away, not calling him back, just watching in silence. The wind blew gently through her hair, carrying the scent of engine oil, metal, and fabric dust. Things that in the world of tycoons were often considered secondary, but today they had a different value. And in that moment, when the boy named Zane stepped out of the engineering door, she saw something that went beyond any contract, title, or stock chart. Something that cannot be priced. The black limousine was still waiting at the end of the side runway. Callahan got back in, without a word, without a phone call, without an assistant. He slid into the back seat, buckled in slowly, as if he had just escaped a closed-door meeting, but one that had nothing to do with business. No charts, no stocks, no handshakes, just memories. Of a young pilot who had died saving hundreds of lives, and a boy who had carried on that legacy, not through blood, but through silence and greasy hands. The car rolled. No honking, no hurry. In the cabin, he leaned back and closed his eyes. There were lessons he had never been taught in his life. And today, a young mechanic, no degree, no business card, had just taught him the most important lesson of all. Gratitude doesn't need to be declared. It just needs to be timely. In the distance, Zane crossed the parking lot, joining the line of old cars that dotted the edge of the airport. No one saw him off. No one saw him off. But in his hand was a rusty toolbox, and on his wrist was a watch that had belonged to a man who had flown in the sky. And today, his son was repairing something else that had flown. And perhaps the world is still run, not by those who have the power to steer it, but by those who know how to keep it from falling. Because a legacy, sometimes not in the signature ink in the inherited property or in the bronze statues erected in the main hall, but in the engine oil, the rust, and the courage that no one sees. The child who is considered the lowest is sometimes the one who keeps the world from falling. Zane's story. What do you see in it? Let me know how you feel. And if you want, we can continue to explore other stories where silent legacies are still being written every second, every minute.